Welcome to today's webinar on the Modern Slavery Act. As a participant, your microphone is muted, and the only voices you will hear are those of the presenters. Following the presentations, there will be a short question and answer session. You can ask your questions at any stage of the webinar by typing them into the control panel. You will find the control panel at the top right of your screen. Just click on the orange arrow, then open up the grey Questions tab below. This webinar will be recorded and will be available later on the Pennington's Manches website. Now, without further delay, I will hand you over to today's presenters, Chris Sider and Eugene Wojciechowski. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of the attendees joining Eugene and me today. So as you can see, we've got quite a lot that we want to cover with you today. We will briefly remind you of why the Modern Slavery Act exists, and we will also provide a high-level explanation of what commercial entities need to do in order to comply with the Act itself. Now, there are a number of business risks associated with non-compliance with the Act, and they have come to the fore since the Act took effect in 2015. We will explain them, and for example, we will be paying particular attention to the increased media attention. However, on the other side of the equation, there are significant benefits associated with a compliance plus approach, which we will explain too. Then we will help you assess some of the lessons learned so far. We will highlight the emerging trends, and we will identify potential future developments. And Eugene will be inviting you to participate in a poll during this webinar. And if that's not enough for you, we are hoping that at the end of the webinar, we will have enough time for an interactive question and answer session. Now, that's probably quite enough from me as an introduction, so over to you, Eugene.
Thanks, Chris. So what does modern slavery consist of under the Modern Slavery Act? Under the legislation, both slavery and human trafficking are covered. Slavery is behaviour on the part of the offender as if he or she did own the person, which deprives the victim of their freedom. Servitude is also covered and is the obligation to provide services that are imposed by the use of coercion, and includes the obligation for a serf to live on another person's property with the impossibility of changing his or her condition. Forced or compulsory labour is also covered, as is human trafficking, which is when a person arranges or facilitates the travel of another person with a view to that person being exploited. The offence can be committed even where the victim consents to the travel. Statistics have shown there to be a 47% worldwide increase in victims of modern slavery since 2012. 1/3 of the victims are male, with 1/4 being children. 1/10 of victims are working within domestic servitude, such as housekeepers, and approximately 1/3 are victims of labour exploitation within manual jobs, with 75% of such victims being male. The most common area is sexual exploitation, which makes up 42% of victims, of which 20% are children. Cannabis cultivation is the second most common form of criminal exploitation, with approximately 81% of those involved being children. According to the Global Slavery Index 2016, Asia is the worst offender, with North Korea having the highest prevalence, with 4.4% of its population enslaved. This is followed by Uzbekistan, with 4% of its population in slavery, and then Cambodia with 1.7%. India has the highest number of those enslaved, with 18.35 million, followed by China with 3.39 million and Pakistan with 2.13 million. The European Union recorded the largest increase in slavery of any world region in 2017, with the arrival of more than 100,000 migrants, many of them extremely vulnerable to exploitation. The second edition of the Modern Slavery Index shows that modern slavery risks have risen in nearly 3/4 of the 28 member states of the European Union over the last year. Romania, Greece, Italy, Cyprus and Bulgaria are the worst offenders. More men women and children are being abused and exploited for the sole purpose of making money for criminals than at any other time in history. There's a global epidemic affecting the UK. There are an estimated 13,000 victims of modern slavery and trafficking in the UK, with 25% of modern slaves being children under the age of 18. There are more slaves in the world today than at any other point in history, with an estimated 21 to 36 million men, women and children. Globally, only 1 to 2% of people held in slavery are ever rescued, and every 30 seconds someone in the world is forced into modern slavery. Theresa May has said, "This is the great human rights issue of our time. I'm determined that we make it a national and international mission to rid our world of this barbaric evil." With the Modern Slavery Act, the UK is leading the world in stamping out modern slavery, and it's expected that many other countries will follow our example. And now back to Chris.
Thank you, Eugene, for that compelling explanation of why the Modern Slavery Act is so important. Now, what I'm going to do now is basically highlight how the media is increasing its focus on business to do more in respect of modern slavery. Now, this first article by the Independent is the type of article which we're seeing more and more of. It highlights the criminal risks for business given the investment by the government in enforcement. On this occasion, the targeted raids took place across 3 British cities that led to arrests of 11 people in London, Birmingham and Gateshead. Now, they were suspected of being part of a Europe-wide people smuggling ring. Now, some of our clients don't appear to appreciate that the Modern Slavery Act includes criminal offences, and they're also not particularly aware of the fact that under the Immigration Act 2016, the new Gang Masters Labour Abuse Authority, which is known now as the GLAA, was granted an extended remit and additional powers to investigate all forms of labour abuse in England and Wales. So this type of article is more likely rather than being less likely. And that was endorsed last week at a conference that I attended, where the CEO, Paul Broadbent, for the GLA was speaking, and he made it very clear that he will have no tolerance, no patience for business if they are found to be implicated in modern slavery crimes, turning around to them and saying, we weren't aware of our responsibilities. Now, this second article is actually a good example of the government's ongoing commitment to eradicating modern slavery, as Eugene was just referring to. It also highlights the increasing calls upon business to do far more than they are currently doing, especially with regard to leveraging their supply chains. So what the Evening Standard was highlighting was that Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, was urging businesses to do more to identify the highest risks of modern slavery in their supply chains. And she did that whilst chairing the first Business Against Slavery Forum of company chiefs in London. And to quote her, she said, "I want to see businesses identifying where the highest risks of modern slavery are and taking targeted steps to address those risks. We know that collaboration is crucial." And this third article is a classic recent example of the demands on business to do far more. And in particular, what I'm talking about here is the demands from civil societies and NGOs, trade unions, for example. Within this article, it highlighted a recent survey by the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, known as CIPS, where alarmingly they reported that 1 in 10 UK supply chain managers have found evidence of modern slavery in their supply chain since the Act came into force in 2015. The survey also revealed that of those required to complete a statement, only a third of British companies haven't done so. In addition, the article highlighted a recent study of 50 big name brands by CORE, which to the unaware is a corporate accountability watchdog, and to quote Marion Crozier, CORE's director, "The level of compliance is disappointing. Since the government has positioned itself as a leader on modern slavery, there has to be more action in sanctioning companies for not reporting." So what the media attention is demonstrating is that at some point something has to give. either the pressure to do more will slide away, or business will be forced or compelled to do more. And what I will do, I will explain later why we feel business will be compelled to do more. So without further ado, back to Eugene.
Thanks again, Chris. Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act provides an obligation on commercial organisations which supply goods or services and have a business or part of a business in the UK and have a global turnover of not less than £36 million to produce a slavery and human trafficking statement for each financial year ending on or after the 31st of March 2016. It doesn't matter if the organisation pursues primarily charitable purposes, educational aims, or purely public functions, and such organisations may be covered. Home Office guidance provides that an organisation is expected to publish its slavery and human trafficking statement as soon as reasonably practical after the end of each financial year, and encourages organisations to do so within 6 months of the financial year end to which the statement relates. The guidance also suggests that an organisation may decide to publish its statement alongside its annual or non-financial reports. There's no minimum level of business or turnover that must be attributable to the UK itself. It's the global turnover that counts. Companies, partnerships and LLPs are included wherever incorporated or established. And you must look at each parent and subsidiary organisation in a group structure to see if they fulfil the requirements of Section 54. If a parent meets the Section 54 requirements, it must provide in its statement the steps taken to prevent modern slavery by all its subsidiaries whose activities form part of the parent's supply chain or business, whether or not based in the UK. A subsidiary which meets the Section 54 requirements in its own right must produce a statement. Also, franchisors and franchisees must also produce statements if they meet such requirements, although when looking at the franchisor's turnover, it's the franchisee's turnover which is not included. So let's look at some examples which illustrate which companies in an international group which work together may be caught by Section 54. Looking at example 1, here Big Tech UK has a turnover of £20 million. Its US parent company, Big Tech Global, has a worldwide turnover of £300 million. In this case, Big Tech Global will have to publish a Section 54 statement as it is carrying on business in the UK. Big Tech UK, however, will not have to publish a statement because it does not meet the minimum turnover threshold. And now let's look at example 2. Here, Megabrand UK has a turnover of £40 million and Megabrand Global has a worldwide turnover of £500 million. In this case, Megabrand Global will have to publish a Section 54 statement, and Megabrand UK will also have to publish a Section 54 statement, but it may amend or republish that of its parent company. We'd now like to ask you a question. If you could please answer yes, no, or don't know. Okay, we'll come back to the results at the end of our presentation. So how should the annual statement be written? A statement should be written in simple language and easily understood. It must be succinct, but also it should cover all relevant points. It should be in English, although it may also be in other languages, and it should specify steps taken on a country-by-country basis, where applicable, and provide appropriate links to other publications, policies, and publicly available documents for the organisation, and of course it must be true and refer to actual steps taken or begun. So what information should be included in the annual statement? The organisation's structure, business and supply chain should be referred to, along with the policies in relation to slavery and human trafficking, due diligence process in relation to slavery, identification of where there is a risk of slavery and human trafficking, and also the training available and the organisation's effectiveness in dealing with slavery. For companies, a board director must approve the statement, and for partnerships, a designated partner must sign off, and the statement must be published on an organisation's website with a link to it on the home page. No direct financial penalty for non-compliance is provided, but the Secretary of State may enforce the duty to prepare a statement by injunction proceedings. And now back to Chris.
Okay, thanks, Eugene. Now, being frank, it's clear that not all businesses that should have produced a statement have done so thus far. When they start to think about the issues and think about whether they can comply, what this slide demonstrates is it's a very emotive subject, and it brings up a lot of different considerations. But once it's made the decision that it will comply with the annual reporting requirements, then in our experience there are a number of ethical and commercial considerations that come to the fore. Business will need to assess a number of things, but in no particular order here. They're going to need to assess the legal risks that exist with any association with criminal activity, human rights abuses in the supply chain. Whilst in the past they may not have wanted to think about it, now they're going to have to think about it, and therefore they're going to have to consider what they're going to do, for example, if they did find modern slavery in their supply chain. With that, they're going to have to consider the inherent public relations, brand reputational risks associated with modern slavery. How would they react if it was brought to their attention that one of their key suppliers was found to have modern slavery within its business operations? The reason I'm highlighting this is that invariably the media attention for businesses that are linked to modern slavery is negative. Just ask Sports Direct how they felt and continue to feel when modern slavery was found in their warehouse earlier this year. It's a very frequently used example because Sports Direct is a brand that's been damaged by a number of issues, not just by modern slavery. So whilst the tendency has been for business to voluntarily promote and operate to high ethical standards, often as a result of procurement exercises, we are now seeing the following trends start to emerge. We are seeing increasing business leadership awareness of ethical standards. We're seeing these businesses consider the points on the slide. As a result, we're seeing more assessment and improvements to internal risk assessments, internal controls, and reporting procedures. And we're also beginning to see more focus on recruitment procedures, especially businesses' use of temporary and agency workers to check, for example, that the suppliers of labour are providing workers that have the right to work in the UK, for instance. So the Modern Slavery Act has undoubtedly been a catalyst. It's been a game-changing law insofar as it has made business have to engage in its responsibility to respect human rights of its workers and to consider those within its supply chain. Indeed, Switzerland, Canada, France, Holland, just to name a few, have all introduced their own modern slavery-related legislation since the UK enacted the Modern Slavery Act back in 2015. And currently Australia is consulting upon its own Modern Slavery Act. Now this next slide is there because of the fact that what I want to bring to everyone's attention is the fact that the government has clearly learned the importance of keeping the eradication of modern slavery not only in the public domain but also higher up on corporate agendas. Last month we saw Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, issue refreshed government guidance for the Modern Slavery Act. Now whilst there was no change to the law, the revised guidance took an important step in the right direction so far as civil society is concerned, as it now states that a statement should aim to include information about each of the 6 Section 54 categories that Eugene was just referring us to. Now the change is that in the past the guidance referred to may include. So we've gone from may include to should aim to include information about. So there's a clear movement and a clear indication to business that there is an expectation that it will do more with regard to ensuring that the 6 categories of data information is published in their statements. It may have been missed by some, but to highlight also that the updated guidance also removed the passage that stressed that the section 54 brackets 5 categories were not compulsory, and that they just provided guidance and examples as the type of information to include. Now, many lawyers, many advisors therefore latched on to that note in the guidance when discussing with businesses what should go in their statements. That removal now means that when we move into the second round, third round, fourth round of statements, there is a trend clearly for business to provide more disclosure in respect of those 6 categories. And with that in mind, business also needs to consider the fact that there are currently 2 private members' bills going through the parliamentary process at the moment, but one in particular is gathering a lot of support. Now, that bill proposes that in addition to commercial organisations, so think private sector, public authorities will also be required to make modern slavery statements. That could be a game changer. The Secretary of State would also be required to publish a list of all commercial organisations that are required to publish a statement under Section 54. Again, that public depository of the list of companies will be latched onto by civil society to encourage more engagement with the requirement to provide a statement. And I apologise now, I'm going to be a typical lawyer and be a bit techie. It's Regulation 57, if I'm correct, of the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. It's proposed they will be amended so that a bidder will be prevented from participating in a public procurement procedure unless it has complied with the obligation to publish a statement. So just think about the 6 categories that Eugene was referring to, the need to indicate what due diligence you are undertaking, and also how are you monitoring the effectiveness, what key performance indicators do you have in place in your statement. So those businesses currently taking a rather minimal compliance approach, because this was new, this is something they hadn't been doing before, if they're not careful, they may soon find themselves being left behind both by their marketplace, their sector, but also by the next legal developments in the UK. Now, what this slide is demonstrating is, again, it's referring to what Eugene was highlighting before in respect of voluntary initiatives to collate modern slavery statements. So this is the Modern Slavery Registry, and at the time that we took the screenshot for the preparation of this webinar, there were 3,180 statements, but perhaps more interesting, across 26 sectors. So the reality is the ability to compare and assess annual statements clearly already exists. Now, as a result of developing that free registry of modern slavery statements, it's therefore very easy for interested stakeholders to assess the level of business commitment to Modern Slavery Act reporting. And as a result, it's very easy for those to critique how business is doing. Indeed, civil society bases much of its benchmarking work, much of its data, on the extent to which organisations have included disclosures of each of these 6 topics in section 54.5 of the Act. And that's what the core director was specifically referring to when I quoted her earlier. So we think in time, we expect more businesses to comply with the Act. We think there's a clear direction of travel. Consequently, businesses should expect more, not less, assessment of their statements by civil society. And we would expect to see more, not less, sector and country approaches being assessed, and hopefully best practice approaches being focused on name and faming compliance and best practice to encourage others to comply, rather than the more, I would argue, easier tendency, which is to name and shame those who are often doing their best to start their journey to show compliance. So, what can I do to convince business to do more? Well, business cannot forget that modern slavery is criminal. And with the new and improved Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority powers of enforcement, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that we're going to see more, not less, risk of prosecution and prison sentences in the UK. We also need to take on board the facts. modern slavery is most likely already in supply chains in the UK. And it's therefore not too difficult to come to a conclusion that a supply chain based on criminal activity is never going to be viewed by those accountable for the business as a sustainable business model. Clearly something has to be reviewed and something has to be done if that is the risk within the business model. Now this is particularly pertinent for those of you in the retail, construction and agricultural sectors, because the facts indicate quite clearly that the risk of modern slavery is higher in those sectors in particular. So what I'm now going to highlight, as you can see from the slide, is let's deal with if there's just allegations of modern slavery. So no particular order. If a business has to deal with an allegation, there's clearly going to be lost management time. And in our experience, if the media is involved or indeed just sniffing around, then we're often talking about crisis PR management as well. Regretfully, and this may be rather cheeky on behalf of a lawyer to raise this, but look, the fact of the matter is that the business is going to most likely incur not insignificant legal costs. And the reason being is that there are wide-ranging implications for a business and its supply chain if there are allegations of modern slavery being made. This could potentially lead to long-lasting brand damage. Just think of the implications for the garment sector following the Rana Plaza disaster, for example. Also, just think about the disclosure obligations and future procurement exercises. Who in their right mind wants to put on a tender document that, yes, there have been allegations of modern slavery made, and therefore that has to be brought to the attention of, say, a local authority who you want to win work from? Think also with regard to the fact that, are you actually walking the walk? If you are saying that your statement and policies are reflecting good practice and update, are they in reality? Would you pass an inspection from a customer coming to your site to demonstrate that you are taking the right steps to ensure there isn't modern slavery in your business or in its supply chain? Then think about what would happen if you lost investor confidence. You know, it's the old adage of no smoke without fire. And what I'm basically talking about here, just remember, modern slavery, it's criminal. It's often hidden, it's often covert, but criminals rely on an unwillingness to report in order to perpetuate their crimes of modern slavery. And it's a figure that's well known, but to quote again, the ILO, the International Labour Organization in Geneva, it estimates that the value of modern slavery year on year is 150 billion US dollars. That is an obscene amount of money. This is big business. And therefore you've got to work on the basis that the criminals will take steps to try to keep this hidden. But also just pause for a moment and just think about the potential damage to employer-employee relations. So your business or your key supplier has been accused of having modern slavery within it. How do you think your talented staff will react? Do you think they're going to want to work for your business that has modern slavery in its business operations or who it does business with? Now, all of the points I'm making here, this ignores if there's any involvement in criminal prosecutions, and it certainly ignores if there were actual criminal convictions or confiscation orders made by, for example, the GLAA. So, let's talk about trends. So in response to the risks I was highlighting around modern slavery allegations, we have seen, amongst other, the following trends start to emerge. Government recognition that it needs to collaborate with business in order to meet its goal to eradicate modern slavery. In so doing, it is using both carrots and sticks, as we've seen in the new guidance, to develop that collaboration and expectation that business will see the merits of a compliance plus approach. And bear in mind what I'm saying to you is the fact that now is the time to start getting on board in respect of the 6 categories of information in section 54. Rather than being forced upon you later. Secondly, as a result of more business engagement, we are seeing increasing numbers of sectors and businesses adopting a more holistic, coordinated business approach to compliance. Following the necessary training, which clearly has to be provided, we have seen more internal policies and procedures being reviewed to promote greater accountability across the business. We have seen more challenge within business as well, and this is in order to ensure policies and procedures are effective. So, for example, if there's an audit or an inspection, they demonstrate that the processes are in place to deal with this effectively. So with that increased focus on accountability, then as more ethical employment issues grab media attention, and what I'm talking about here is things like zero-hours contracts, full self-employment, such as, think of the Uber litigation, the gig economy and the challenges now to the legislation, gender pay, worker rights to a national living wage, and more recently issues around payment of holidays for workers. We are seeing a renewed focus on labour rights and enforcement in the UK. Business is asking more questions and will need to continue asking itself questions. Nevertheless, business does appear to better understand that being the cheapest supplier of goods or services is now more likely to bring more scrutiny with regard to how that price is actually being achieved. Businesses seem to appreciate that there's more social awareness. Many appear to understand the importance of their business having sustainable business relationships with stakeholders, and in particular the supply chain. So in short, the medium-long-term value of being an employer-supplier of choice appears to be better understood, because basically if UK employers, for example, recognise, as a result of legislation such as the Equality Act, that you can't discriminate, bully or harass your staff whilst they're at work, then they are beginning to recognise that they shouldn't be accepting forced labour conditions in their business supply chains. That's not that big a leap when you think about it in those terms, but that leap, that engagement would be a significant step to demonstrating business responsibility to respect human rights, and within that there's great potential for business to develop a competitive edge as a result of clearly demonstrating it is doing the right thing. So I'm conscious that I tend to talk too much about these things, but look, in summary, there is strong government commitment to eradicate modern slavery, more calls on business to collaborate and do more. We should all be in no doubt that UK government wants to be seen as a global leader in this regard. Given what other countries are doing to address modern slavery, businesses that operate internationally also need to keep an eye on new national laws as well. So those of you with interest in Australia, for example, keep an eye on what they're up to, particularly when their legislation comes through in 2018. Be in no doubt that the two biggest business risks of being associated with modern slavery are clearly prison and immediate cancellation of commercial contracts. I wouldn't want to have to explain that. Now, therefore, it's not really acceptable if you accept those risks to continue to turn a blind eye or adopt a minimal compliance approach, because what we're saying is you clearly are running the risk of not demonstrating the responsibility to respect human rights, i.e. that responsibility to walk the walk when complying with the Act's annual reporting requirements. We feel that future annual statements that do not demonstrate more due diligence or supply chains, the use of key performance indicators, will fall behind others. And that isn't going to be sustainable for business because they will not be keeping up. They will not be competitive. So a continuing lack of a compliance plus approach will, in our view, more likely as well lead to the government making those 6 reporting recommendations in Section 54 mandatory. So let's just pause there. Those of you that thought that the Act had no teeth, be careful what you wish for, because if Section 54 becomes mandatory, there are going to be a lot of difficult conversation within businesses as to how they're going to be developing their due diligence, their inspection, their reporting, and more importantly, measuring the effectiveness of how they're dealing with modern slavery in their business and the supply chains. So it follows that those businesses that agree with the merits of a compliance plus approach will need to have a plan if it does find modern slavery in its supply chain. And this is a topic that we hope to come back to you in future webinars in 2018. Now, that's probably quite enough from me for today. So I'm going to hand back to Eugene. Hopefully we have those poll results. Over to you, Eugene.
Thanks, Chris, and we certainly do have the poll results in. The question, has your organisation provided modern slavery training? 15% of you answered yes, and we can see there's a significant majority of you who answered no, 74%, and 11% answered don't know. And now over to Judy for the questions.
Thank you. We've had a few questions coming in for you, but first of all, Chris, do you want to give any further comments on the results of the poll?
It's probably an indication that business has started to think about the Modern Slavery Act and has adopted a minimal compliance approach thus far, but there's clearly the second step hasn't started. If what was it, 75% are saying there's been no training, and let's work on the basis that those attending this webinar today are interested in modern slavery, there's clearly a gap there, because if people are not being trained, how can internal policies and procedures be relevant and up to date? But I think the more alarming statistic is the indications of how many didn't know whether there'd been any training. So the poll result indicates that those on the webinar might want to have a word within their own businesses about their statements, but more particularly, are they taking steps to ensure that the right people are trained within their organisations?
Right, and now turning to our first question, Chris, for you. Are companies actually taking this legislation seriously, given that there are no financial penalties for a failure to comply with reporting obligations?
Well, look, in short, probably at the beginning, no, but what we're highlighting the trend is now there are more and more. And there's a number of reasons for that. And so I would answer the question by saying that businesses are now taking it more seriously than they were perhaps in 2015-16. And I would highlight the government commitment, the media attention, the enforcement issues that flow from the creation of the Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority. So Judy, it's one of those where we can answer that by saying there's clearly a journey for business, but I would say, in short, it's getting better.
And Eugene, who within an organisation is actually responsible for dealing with issues related to the Modern Slavery Act?
Now, there's no specific person within an organisation who's required to deal with such issues. However, what we found generally within organisations, it would be perhaps the compliance officer, a company secretary, or it could be the HR director or head of legal who would deal with this.
Thanks. Chris, can you comment on what type of things employees should be looking out for when they're considering whether someone is being subjected to modern slavery?
Hey, we hope to do a further webinar in respect to this issue because it's a common question that we're asked. But in short, it's asking more questions. It's just being more engaged with those that you are working with. So let me use the construction sector as an example. If on a construction site you are working with hired-in workers for a particular phase of the project, and they are arriving, for example, in a van, so they're being taken there, they're then being collected, and they're shy, they're not really talking to you, you think they come from a foreign country, for example. Ask more questions, show more interest in them, ask how they are, because often if you are the victim of modern slavery, you are vulnerable, you are shy, you are concerned, you therefore need people to show more interest.
Eugene, you mentioned various things which would be sensible to put in the annual statement, but are these a legal requirement or just best practice?
Now, the Home Office guidance provides that within the statement you must include the steps the organisation is taking during the financial year to ensure slavery and human trafficking isn't taking place in its supply chain or business. But other than that, there's no prescribed form or length.
I'm going to throw this question open to both of you. Chris, first of all, how does the UK's performance against modern slavery compare with other countries?
Well, we clearly stole the march. We clearly have the game-changing provisions in respect to Section 54 and the obligations of business to produce statements year on year. As I referred to, other countries are taking their own steps. For example, France has compelled larger companies to produce a vigilance plan, and a failure to do that, Judy, could lead to a potential fine of up to 10 million euro. So other countries arguably have gone further in respect of the potential sanctions that apply.
I'd say that also on a positive note, world pressure, UK pressure appears to be working in certain countries. Qatar, one example, it's got a reputation for allowing many employees employed therein as domestic servants to work in slave-like conditions, perhaps working over 100 hours a week with no holidays, no breaks. And a few months ago, under pressure from the ILO, Qatar proposed the introduction of legislation which would limit the working time of domestic servants to 10 hours per day, and also provide for 1 day off each week and 3 weeks holiday per year. So that's a significant step. So there has been some movement in the right direction there.
Now, this brings us to the end of our live webinar session, but as I mentioned at the beginning, a recording of it will be available on our website later. Thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about developments around modern slavery, both in the UK and internationally, you can visit the Business and Human Rights page on the Employment section of our website for regular updates. I'm sorry that we haven't actually had time to answer all of your questions today, but Chris and Eugene will respond to you directly if your question wasn't answered. If you have any further or more specific questions that you would like to follow up, please feel free to contact either Chris or Eugene. You can see their contact details on the screen now. Both are happy to follow up on any points with you over the coming weeks. Thank you.